you to this morning's online Bible study. Whether you're tuning in at Twitter or Periscope at Bible Study Cam, whether you're on Facebook.com/Reflective Bible Study, whether you're on YouTube at The Online Preacher, or even at theonlinepreacher.com/live, wherever you happen to be tuning in, whether it's one of those places or somewhere else, whether this is on live or on replay, I want to welcome you to this morning's online Bible study. And this morning, we're going to be looking at a relatively famous passage. This is one of the most clearest examples of just how forgiving Jesus is in the face of all of the stuff that happened throughout his life and ministry. And it serves as a great continuation, you could say, or maybe even a conclusion to the theme of forgiveness that we touched on for the last day or two's worth of Bible study insights. But then I also tagged this as a part one because we're only going to look at the first portion of this passage that focuses on this time, you could say. And then tomorrow we're going to look at the second part, because the second part is typically the part that more people focus in on, and it actually has a huge theme and a huge challenge that would be worth paying attention to. But I didn't want to pack too much into these short Bible studies, and so I decided I would split this passage into two parts. So this morning we're going to read Luke chapter 23, and we're going to read from verses 32 through 38, and then tomorrow we'd read verses 39 through 43. And I'm going to read from the New American Standard Bible. Two others also, who were criminals, were being led away to be put to death with him. This is Jesus. This is the morning of his crucifixion. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him and the other criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. But Jesus was saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves. And the people stood by looking on. And even the rulers were sneering at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up to him, offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." Now there was also an inscription above him that said, "This is the King of the Jews." Now it's amazing in my mind because when Jesus was facing hostility from all around him, verbal hostility, also physical abuse as he's being nailed to the cross and hoisted up and hung, he is focusing on forgiveness. Jesus is focusing on forgiveness when, by any stretch of the imagination, forgiveness is not what would be appropriate, you might say, at that point in time. And so I thought that this passage actually would lead into a great discussion about forgiveness. What forgiveness is, what forgiveness is not, and then drawing our attention onto how it actually ends up being a little bit easier on one hand, but then also harder on another to forgive other people. But Jesus was saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Forgiveness in the Bible, when we look at how it's framed and how it is contrasted, forgiveness simply means letting go. Letting go of the desire to get even, letting go of the desire to get revenge, letting go of the desire to even see judgment. Because in the Bible, when we have it contrasted, when we have forgiveness contrasted with something else, it's the letting go or the holding on to. So if you hold on to something, that's not forgiveness. But if you let it go, that is forgiveness. And so Jesus saying here, as he's being nailed and hung on the cross, Father, let go whatever feelings, whatever hurt, whatever desires for revenge you might have against them. Forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. If they knew what they were doing, it's possible they might still do the exact same thing. But if they knew what they were doing, they probably wouldn't have gone through with it. Now, the religious leaders, they probably would have taken matters into their own hands because they knew a lot more about what they were doing than the Roman soldiers. And what's amazing in my mind is that when we face disagreements with people, when people hurt us, when people abuse us, we have an example in Jesus' life at the most painful moments that Jesus faced, or at least one could argue that these were the most painful moments that Jesus faced. We have him focusing on forgiveness. And it's interesting in my mind because Jesus is praying to God the Father to forgive them. Jesus isn't saying, I forgive them, which is worth paying attention to. We'll come back to that in a moment. Jesus is saying, Father, forgive them. Jesus is asking the Father to extend his forgiveness, which is incredible to think about. Because if you have this perspective or perception of God the Father as being the mean God of the Old Testament who is more than willing to strike you dead if you've done something wrong, that's the impression that some people have of God the Father in the Old Testament. It's fascinating here that Jesus prays for practically the exact opposite. Now, the perception people have in the Old Testament, I don't think it's completely accurate, even though there is slivers of truth in that idea. Because there were times in the Old Testament where God punishes. And when God punishes, it usually means death for the ones who he's punishing. At least in the extreme cases. And it wouldn't be a stretch in my imagination that God punishing all of those present who were actively crucifying and ridiculing his son. It wouldn't be a stretch in my imagination that a bolt of lightning could come down and just take care of all of them, even after Jesus had died. The idea being that Jesus takes his last breath and then a bolt of lightning comes down and just clears the rest of the area out. But that's not what happens. That might be what we would do if we were in that same situation, but that's not what happens. Jesus prays, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Now, from Jesus' perspective, it's interesting because Jesus doesn't say, Father, I forgive them. I mean, we have no record of Jesus saying, I forgive you, you don't know what you're doing. But I believe for Jesus to pray for God to forgive them, Jesus would have to have forgiven them in his heart as well. Because the opposite wouldn't make a lot of sense. The opposite would be Jesus praying, God forgive them even though I'm harboring bitterness and hostility in my heart for them. You're not going to ask God to forgive someone if you're not willing to forgive them. That doesn't make any sense. But you would ask God to forgive them if you have already forgiven them. And so in this simple verse, this simple statement Jesus makes, we've got one of the most profound, if not the most profound example of forgiveness in the entire Bible. Jesus asking the Father to let go the desire for revenge against perhaps just those immediate people who were crucifying Jesus, but perhaps also let go the desire for revenge against the human race for collectively deciding to kill Jesus. It's interesting, Jesus was betrayed by one of his own followers. His own disciples are partly responsible for his death. Jesus was also condemned to death by the Jewish leaders, but specifically, like, we could use this as an example of Jew versus Christian hostility, but instead, the better way to look at it is Jesus was condemned to death by what we would look back on and say was God's religion at that time. The religion, the spiritual framework, the worldview that God had set up, that framework was responsible for Jesus' death. The leaders of that framework collectively decided to kill Jesus. Which means that God's religion, God's people, or quote unquote God's people, they're not exempt as well, because they're also responsible. And then the Romans, they would basically be representative of the secular society they carried through with the crucifixion. And so they're also responsible. We've got Jesus' closest band of followers, we've got God's religion, we've got the secular society, every one of those groups allied together to kill God's Son. Which then makes Jesus' death all of our responsibility as a human race. And Jesus prays to God, Father, forgive the human race, because they don't know what they are doing. Let go your desire for revenge, because I came to redeem them. And so that's what I wanted to draw our attention to this morning with the few minutes that we have, and challenge you, and encourage you, and inspire you, and just prompt you to keep holding on to Jesus, not letting go of Jesus, but letting go of all of the pain and hurt and just stuff that we face in this world that would like to drag us down, all of that baggage, you could call it, as we move step by step, moving towards the day Jesus returns and we go to home to heaven to be with him. And so thank you for tuning in, whether you're tuning in at Twitter or Periscope at Bible Study Cam, whether you're on Facebook, whether you're on YouTube, wherever you happen to be tuning in, thank you for tuning in. And if this passage, this idea, has encouraged or challenged or inspired you and you want to share that with me, jump into any one of the comment boxes, whether it's Twitter or Periscope or Facebook or YouTube. I know Periscope's comment stream will end as soon as this live stream ends, but I'll still see those comments. And if you're on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, jump into any one of those comments and I will jump in periodically throughout the day and interact with you, and let's keep this conversation going. And if this discussion, this idea, this subject of forgiveness, you know of someone who would be inspired or challenged or encouraged by it, then let me encourage you to share this video with them. Because together, let's keep our hearts and our minds and our eyes and our perspectives focused on Jesus and on his soon return. Now, before signing off, I want to re-extend the question that I've asked several mornings in a row now, and that's if you have a passage that you want me to share or discuss or talk about, something that's either weighing on your mind or something that you would just like to see me discuss, then jump into any one of the comment boxes and leave a comment for me. And in the coming mornings and coming weeks, we'll incorporate those passages into what we discuss, so that this Bible study insight, you could say, this live stream won't just be about me, it will be about us and focusing us on Jesus. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you tomorrow.